despite not being as much a classic as 1 or 2, not as stylish or iconic as Vice City, and definitely nowhere near as timeless or groundbreaking as San Andreas, I feel it's a waste that GTA 3 stands nowadays almost entirely on what it once was, or at least what it once was to you personally. It's remembered fondly, don't get me wrong, but even by the standards set by other games at the time, it's hardly praised for having the best story, graphics, or even gameplay. And despite really not wanting to get into that, because believe me, I have enough to talk about already, I find it a shame because what it does offer is something so much more that it almost transcends the need for any of those things. In fact, you could argue that they'd even detract from it. And my whole life, and surprisingly often from day to day at this point, I'm always just left asking myself, what is it about this game that makes it such a big deal to me, despite personally not even really liking it as a video game in the traditional sense? Why is it that it's this, of all games, that remains and has always been in the forefront of my mind as one of the best? And how is it that no other game since has managed to do this? Since this. I can point to it, show it, reference it, but where, when, and how exactly the many hundreds of aspects all come together in what is a chemical reaction of tone, atmosphere, feelings, and general mood is easily one of the most complicated and fascinating things the medium of video games has ever achieved. So really, all I can do if I really want to talk about it, and I do, believe me, is this. It's important to say first though that although I'm going to be ignoring the video game GTA 3 to show how it runs much deeper than the game itself, everything leading up to the game handing control over to you is just unavoidable and contributes a huge amount to your expectations and how you interpret things once you do have control enough to explore and make your own discoveries. And that absolutely includes everything. Even the UI, the menus, before you've even started the fucking game, are these weird, stark, trippy soundscapes. And where the standard would be the generic beeps and boops of an ordinary menu, here every movement, selection, adjustment is marked with these surreal, crushingly deep, low-end sub-shots. It's like trainers hitting carpet, it just reverberate forever if they were allowed to, and it makes everything just so much more weird, but iconically weird. Because it's just not done like this anywhere else. Where else is there anything like this? It's genuinely relaxing and ASMR inducing, it's like a dub techno aesthetic. Which, not that that's anything to complain about, it's just odd considering the game it's in, because otherwise, and with that being said...
Sorry babe, I'm an ambitious girl. You're just small time.
That is as much story and context as anyone who plays this is forced into, and where the game part of GTA 3 finally shuts up if you just threw your arms up and left it right there. Because being an open world, you can just ignore the rest of the story and missions if that's really what you wanted out of this, and a lot of you might remember that back then a lot of people did, me included. And regardless of whether or not that's because sandbox games were just such a new and novel concept, messing around and causing chaos was just more fun, or in my case because it didn't feel like the game wanted me to do anything else. Because while not every open world game is realistic, every game set in an open world is trying to create the illusion of being real, because you can see it all, it's alive in that it moves, breathes and operates with or without you, whether you step in to interact with it or just watch. And because, provided you haven't committed any major crimes, real life is also open world, that's issue number 1 right there. Like it or not, setting your stylized, exaggerated neo-noir game in a world where injured civilians are revived by dispatched paramedics, fires are actively extinguished, murders result in crime scenes, and where the sun sets and rises, it rains, storms. Obviously, I and a lot of others were going to interpret this game as a depiction of real life. But still, on its own, that is fine. In fact, it's good. Realism sells games in a lot of cases, and every new gen it seems to be what developers aspire to do above everything else. It's when the reasons I've just listed meet the ones I'm about to that the fusion reaction that lights this universe begins. The first thing anyone playing this immediately notices is where they are. The city itself, which is an island surrounded on all sides by nothing. There's no open roads in, and the only visible landmass is literally just that. A barren pile of nothing. Which, to be fair, has always been the case in every GTA game, but it's always been as bizarre and strange to me as well. It might not be unique, but on top of everything else, it definitely doesn't help. And although generally I'd say the majority of people are just absolutely not gonna care or understand where I'm coming from in this video as a whole, even those people I myself have witnessed at a certain point just ask themselves, what even is this place? For reasons that are all, obviously, only exaggerated massively by GTA III's 2 biggest things that it introduced to the series, being that it's 3D and that it was the first to introduce boats. It's not the first time I've said this, but one of my strange quirks when I'm dropped into an open world is to immediately try and leave as soon as possible, in any way I can. Almost as if, when I'm handed a game where I can, quote, go anywhere, I immediately want to start testing the boundaries of that, to push the limits, to try and prove them wrong. I'm not sure how relatable that is generally, but here I know it is because there's literally nothing else to do here. There is nowhere in this game that is only accessible by boat unless you count this one hidden package. In fact, using the boats at all makes things infinitely and needlessly more awkward than they need to be since water is an instant death. So everyone who has ever even gotten into one in this game, I'm willing to bet, was only doing so just out of curiosity, to see what was going to happen at the very outer limits of this world. To find nothing. I'm hesitant to say this anywhere else, but it feels like there was a considerable effort on their part to make this aspect of the game nothing less than this. Lonely and eerie. I can't imagine it was their intention, because why? And it seems so deliberate I can't bring myself to consider it being a mistake either. The boats themselves are cripplingly slow and don't have radios, so by getting in one you literally are sentencing yourself to crushing silence, the droning hum of the engine and howling wind and rain for the long journey out into nothing. The view distance means you're almost immediately visually stranded, if it wasn't for the minimap that is. The game's weather means you don't have to wait 3 minutes for waves to outgrow the size of your boat, tossing it around like it's nothing. And like with any body of water in this game being an instant death, the risks are tripled. So fighting all of that and getting here to find the invisible barrier is just so anticlimactic. The fact that there really is nothing anywhere makes you doubt it, so you're already from the offset looking for something that isn't here, expecting something, anything. In large part because, and like I've mentioned, the game in every other sense takes itself seriously, so not having any form of handling this inevitable situation that every player is going to try and come out here, instead just resorting to boom, wall. It's just weird, and can only lead to you just assuming that there must be something out here, or that this is how this world is supposed to work. Like, is it an impossibly strong current? Ocean storms? A force field? Obviously not, because that's dumb, but because it's not any of those things and the answer is actually just that they put an invisible wall there because they either didn't or couldn't think of anything better. My point is, and what I'm trying to say, is that this, coming out here and experiencing this weird little moment with the game, is a part of the game. What, did they think this just wasn't gonna happen? There's almost no way this wasn't gonna happen, so when it does, it alters your perception of the game as a whole. In what is a somehow even stranger addition still, however, the section of ocean that separates the game's islands to stop you from accessing the third one before the end of the game is divided by these literally infinitely stretching above sea industrial steam pipes. That, first of all, would seem to imply that they were aware of how insufficient a measure the invisible barriers were, because they obviously weren't a good enough excuse to separate the islands, but more importantly are just visually the weirdest things to just look at, because this couldn't exist. It's a stretch, but in that respect it really reminds me of the world the movie Eraserhead takes place in that more of it than needs to be is just all factories, industrial buildings, and covered in miles of metallic piping that's purpose is not only irrelevant, but that also clearly doesn't even really exist. Because it's there for the visual aspect alone, and obviously not to actually produce anything. And that's regardless of whether it's to represent some deeper point or just to stop you from skipping the islands like it is here. So it's weird, at least. But if you decide you really want to think about it, it creates this cool atmosphere of a world built around a vast, nonsensically thinly veiled facade of a system of industry and production. And it's when doing that that the entire game begins to topple over. Because it can be done anywhere, with the commercial, business and residential districts too. Because you could even say that's exactly what the game is. It's like the Truman Show. North Korean supermarkets, or those NPC copy pastas. Things literally only need to exist in games just to satisfy the player's passing glance. So the second you stop and stare, you find yourself in a cardboard world barely being held together by tape and glue. And the point of this, what I'm going to be trying my best to do, is make the point that although some come very close, there is literally no other game out there currently that suffers more from the brutal, uncanny feelings that are a result of that than GTA III. Feelings that give this game immense value, especially nowadays, because they're completely unintentional on the developer's part and run so much deeper down in the bones of GTA III, way past the gameplay, story, missions and so on. So much so that it's like lightning struck, and I really don't know if we're ever going to get another one of these ever again. But fair enough, the ocean as a concept isn't really ever handled cheerfully in most games, but even where you'd expect it the least, in the lifeblood, the motion, the very soul of this game, instead just shows a complete lack of. The illusion of life here, in the form of the traffic and pedestrians, very quickly, almost immediately I'd say, wears away to reveal the fact that it basically is just there to act as wallpaper, with about as much depth. Because when they're not just flesh-based bowling pins, their purpose is to just kill if you want a wanted level or to avoid if you don't. Which is fine, because if you think about it, complementing the gameplay like that is just good game design. It's just the unintended side effect that has, and that kind of comes bundled with that, is that you, the player, are massively disconnected from the nearest living thing. And probably the most immediately obvious reason for that is just simply the fact that the player's model and skin is just visually way more detailed than anything else's. Which, I mean, is understandable because obviously you'll be looking at it for longer, so they just put more time into making it look right, not to mention the fact that the peds need to be optimized to move around in large crowds. But regardless, and again, the unintended side effect that has is you looking normal, like a person that could potentially exist, in a world where everyone else looks like some kind of horrific, malformed goblin creature. So your brain just can't justify them looking like this out of any kind of technical limitation. So it's really easy to just assume they're supposed to look like that. Supposed to look this uncanny and creepy. The AI was never going to be perfect, and expecting it to be is expecting way too much. But the way they all just blindly wander, single file, going nowhere, coming from nowhere, and seemingly being completely unable to deal with basic situations like there just being a thing in their way, literally having them standing there all scratching their heads at the mere concept. Picking up on any of it starts the train of thought that naturally leads you right into recognizing that your environment is populated exclusively by them. Exclusively with these soulless, mindless human effigies whose purpose is to be killed. Pedestrians like this were definitely a brand new concept at the time, and there really wasn't any established way to do them since GTA 3. So commenting on how this aspect specifically has aged really isn't fair, but at the same time the lines of dialogue they spout literally at random to no one and for no reason just really exaggerates the mindless aspect regardless.
I gotta go on vacation. I don't know where I am and I'm hungry. What the maniac!
Again, in all fairness, having them say nothing would be a lot worse, and I'd be the first to comment on that. But just on top of how odd them talking to themselves is in concept, somehow, further still, the writing is just the most bizarre part. Like, especially, and need I even say it at this point because it's so well known, but the famously strange obsession they have with, for some reason, travelling to the Caribbean island of Aruba.
We're going to Aruba. We're going to Aruba!
Presumably, Rockstar as a company was small enough at this time that in-jokes made it as far as the recording booth, so something probably is going over my head here, and it's definitely far from the only odd thing they just shout out for no reason. But regardless, it occupies such a large percentage of all the dialogue you'll hear in this game that if nothing else, just how confusing it is throws you out of any feeling of normality you might have felt otherwise. The weirdness peaks though just through sheer persistence. They are what they are where they are, they never change, do anything, or really have any other reason to even be there. After a while, you start to zone them out, only really taking notice to maybe appreciate the humour in having to run two of them down to save the one in your ambulance during the paramedic missions. To the point where, and I absolutely shouldn't, but naturally, as you can imagine, very quickly you start to see them as, like, what I would compare to insects. And there might have been some intended commentary there, the sounds would seem to confirm that.
Give me that guy right now!
But in all, it's just a really gross feeling that I don't enjoy but that I'm forced into because of the many ways this aspect of the game was handled. They're just everywhere. They swarm. They just get in the way too often, and it's just too inefficient and difficult to play this game and not accidentally kill any. Almost as if it's engineered that way. Because to relate back to the point I made earlier, it's almost as if this world is supposed to just suck. Death and killing is just that common and normal. Which, and not that the game is bright and cheerful anyway, but it definitely makes it a lot darker. In a similar vein, again, just because you, the player, are interacting with all of this through the main character, you visibly display the only autonomy anywhere in this game. Walking, running, jumping around, punching, you can knock them down, but they'll never react to anything. At all. Unless you've killed or are killing them directly, but even then they'll just run in circles for seconds before giving up and going right back to it, which doesn't exactly make them look conscious. I've always compared how surreal just walking down the street is in this game to those nightmares where you're flailing and screaming trying to get someone's attention but no one can see or hear you. No one even knows you're there. Again, you could apply that to any game, but here how little they react to everything you do makes it infinitely more apparent. Their tunnel vision, their complete and utter dedication to their sole purpose of aimlessly wandering back and forth, literally forever, is definitely a big part of what makes this game creepy to just watch. And my favourite thing about open world games in general is you could theoretically watch it forever, for as long as you could keep the PC or console powered, in theory. In fact, since ultimately nothing reacts, you not being able to have any real lasting impact on anything no matter how much destruction or devastation you cause, leaves the world feeling static to the point of being stuck in time, permanently, unchanging, just repeating the same cycles over and over. The immediate consequenceless respawns after dying really drills that in. It literally doesn't end. There's no escape, no matter which way or how violently you go out. It'll always just fade to white and you'll wake up back at the hospital again, over and over, every single time. Whenever I happen to bring this subject up, and I always bring this up, by far my favourite aspect to talk about is the game's sound. Because whereas complimenting something that's either just through my own questionable interpretation or that could just be the result of a mistake, when it comes to GTA 3's sound, I really am just simply complimenting some genuinely well done and legitimately genius audio design. It's easily by far the most underappreciated aspect, and I'd say even goes completely unnoticed in a lot of cases, which is criminal, or should be. Because, and I guess I've never even really thought about it before, but excluding the UI chimes and mission past jingle, every single sound in the entire game is diegetic, including the licensed soundtrack. Amazingly, in a way, I guess you could say that it doesn't even really have one. The music doesn't complement the gameplay or scenes and isn't even really there to, because in that sense, the radio stations are coming from the environment. And unlike other games with licensed soundtracks, if you think about it, here they're technically just a part of the soundscape. Sure, alright, that doesn't change much, but to really make full use of it and to not waste it as a concept, they're all far from just a collection of licensed songs like they are in other games, and in fact complement the world by populating it. Story characters can phone into chat shows, you'll be like listening to head radio, then just happen to drive past the studios where it's recorded, and by far my favourite example is Rise FM, which is implied to be a live set being broadcast from somewhere in the city. And I know I'm kind of going off on one here, but to give off that kind of vibe, all the tracks are mixed down with this weird high-pass filter, as if they're being mic-recorded directly in the room the speakers are in. They're all really good songs that just sound horrible, and it adds everything. It just wouldn't be the same experience otherwise, and it's just a really surreal way to listen to them, and music in general, I guess. It sounds strange, off, but at the same time lo-fi and comfy. It's like vaporwave or YouTube vibe music 20 years before that would even become a thing. I really cannot get over just how much this would go on to contribute to everything I'm into nowadays. The entire game for that matter. It gives off so much atmosphere. It reminds me of being a kid and inheriting boxes full of poorly labelled, awful sounding cassette mixtapes. To this day, not knowing what any of the songs were, where they had come from, or even whether or not I was the only person to have ever even heard them. They were mysterious, kinda like in the same way that a lot of lost media is. The other, more standard background audio and sound effects though are not any worse either. In fact, I'd say they're one of the primary reasons this game is what it is and what inspired this very video. Because, and with the exception of the car engines and pedestrians dialogue, everywhere there's anything worth hearing is anywhere where there are no cars or pedestrians, or any other reason to even go there for that matter. The waves, the wind, the birds by the dock, that one apartment complex that just has people loudly blasting licensed house music that isn't even in the game's soundtrack, by the way. Which is insanely cool and never brought up enough. It would have been so easy for them to have just filtered one of the stations, but instead, this way, it gives the game something of real value to discover by exploring. It shows that at least some foresight was given to the atmosphere of this game, outside of the game if the player were to just walk away from it. Because there really is nothing else here. It's empty. No missions take place here, there's no collectibles, secrets, pickups, or again, if you're playing this game as a game, really any reason for you to even be here. In that sense, a hardline game design Nazi might call it bad level design and comment on how it's not making use of space, resources, or assets, but I always feel like those people are so pointlessly restricting everything for no reason, and I will never understand how that benefits anyone. Because for one thing, the burden is on them to explain why The feelings that come from there just being a little shiny thing there because it's a video game and you have to run around and collect the things, are any better or the preferred alternative to the feelings that come from exploring and just naturally arriving at a location within a game and there just being nothing there. Because are they any better? Really? I definitely wouldn't say so. The arguments made in better faith would go on to say that it's because it would take more effort and planning, but that still just entirely rules out ever being able to do this deliberately, even if you wanted to by design. And if your metric for whether or not something is good is how much effort it takes, then nothing is good because everything ever could always, in theory, be given slightly more attention, and then nothing would ever be finished. Although maybe this is more obvious than I think and no one actually really takes those arguments seriously anyway, because here, when you reach one of these spots, it just implies that some foresight was given to what the player could be doing in a sandbox game where doing whatever you personally want to do is encouraged, and in this case, that's exploring. And in that respect, since there is nothing else in a lot of these spots, regardless of whether or not that be by design or just because they didn't have the opportunity to properly populate it, your attention is naturally drawn to what you can see and hear, that being the environment and soundscape itself, making you more aware of it and giving you way more respect and appreciation for it. Something that might not have happened otherwise if you just ran in, grabbed the hidden package or item and left again immediately. Sure, alright, that hinges entirely on you coming out here with that intention in the first place, but if there was no sound, you just accept that it's because nothing is going on around you. But when that moment hits and you start to hear the wind and movement of the ocean, your reverberating footsteps against the sprawling concrete tunnel-like alleyways, it purposefully forces your attention to a specific aspect of the environment and soundscape that I know can't have been intentional. The emptiness. It forces you to acknowledge that you're alone. Like when you're in a crowded room that suddenly empties and before you know it, you're hyper aware of every floorboard creak, pipe, open window. But here you're just aware that the world is dead. Because, and to be fair, no game has ever done this well, in a spot like this in a real city, you can still hear distant sirens, disembodied shouting, the distant whooshing of a road or motorway, car horns, something, anything associated with a populated, living city. But here, nothing. And by having the ocean sounds and music, prioritizing that of all things and nothing else, it's like admitting, or at least implying, that the world is completely void of life otherwise. Maybe it isn't a literal conscious thought in that way, but it's what it feels like. It's like the game took all these measures to look and feel real, but just omitted one of the most important parts. It makes it uncanny, because it's strangely familiar enough, but falling short just there, for some reason. In a massive U-turn, and with that being said though, when it does work and in the more central spots, all the ambience in this game just gives it so much more energy and depth to the places out of sight, helping to exaggerate the open world aspect because, with, let's say, the train for example, hearing it just all of a sudden pass by overhead helps to build a sense that the world still exists even though you're not interacting with it. The train, the cars, music, everything is still moving with or without you even being there. And with that, and I'm not sure how relatable this is, but things moving and existing in the walls where you can't necessarily see them directly is always so much more effective at building a world like this. But just a so much more ominous and creepy one. Again, and to be fair, take from this what you will, but if it was just silence in any of these places, it wouldn't be any better and I'd probably still just be out here pointing out how strange and spooky it is. So I guess to me, it was always a lose-lose situation for them, but two very different kinds of lose, in all fairness. This one easily being my favourite, because unlike anywhere else I could even compare this to, it somehow manages to strike this flawless balance between the feeling that all the life is somewhere else, in the buildings, driving away from you, excluding you in any way it can, while at the same time feeling like there is none, that the game is just supposed to be this empty, dead, vacant urban wasteland. Despite it being way too late to be bringing this up now, but by now I feel like you should probably have a more than firm grasp on exactly what this game looks like. Visually. Because a lot of what I've said and shown so far whenever I bring this up with others, what I'll end up hearing is always something along the lines of, well yeah, obviously it looks a bit creepier than a game like this should, it's foggy, raining, or at night. And, well, my response, and point here is, this game is always foggy. I'm not entirely sure how it works exactly, but I've been through the files and spent enough time modding this game over the years to know that every day the weather is pulled from a pool of either clear, cloudy, rainy, or foggy. How it decides and whether or not it's random, I'm not sure, but in that case, and it would seem just from playing the game that the odds, statistically, are against it being anything other than any weather that would just make it look spooky. Sunny is just 1 in 4, and 1 in 8 if you count the nighttime hours, since it can't be sunny without a sun. Good writing, Jay. I have no idea what the thinking or theory behind that was. Maybe the inspiration for the setting, New York, is just a grey, rainy, foggy place. I'm not sure. From pictures at least, it doesn't look like it. And you can just use cheats if you really want to force the mood, but really, and anyone who has played this game for longer than 24 minutes, the length of an in-game day, knows that you only have to sit there and watch it to see the fog just roll in from nowhere, almost immediately, and way more often than the sun ever comes out. So yeah, absolutely, you'd be completely correct in saying that the vibe is in large part due to the weather, but for better or for worse, the weather is the game. For some odd reason, but it's the game that I love as much as to make this. And I mean, it just being here at all aside, it'd be really hard for you to even call it a bad thing because it looks so good. Like real fog. Creepy. And it isn't creepy for any other reason than the fact that it just looks so atmospheric. In the street, it's warmly tinted a deep orange from the streetlights. In the park, it's the palest, saddest shade of grey you'll ever see. And by the sea, it chokes out everything apart from the faint red flashing lights of the distant sea beacons. Because, in short, it looks amazing. But honestly, it can look as good as it wants, and despite the fact that it does, it's really only a slight palette saturation and tinted haze. Its effect comes from, in no small part, because of what it's drowning out. The environment. The city. Liberty City. Visibility limiting devices as spooky, surreal, or atmospheric mechanics in games only work so far as what they're limiting is worth seeing, otherwise why would you care? I've touched on it slightly already, but it's made infinitely more effective right from the offset due to GTA III's map, world, setting, being one of the most surreal places in video game history. 3 islands composed of the most odd places smashed together in an even weirder order and combination. Locations that are full of personality and character, don't get me wrong, but that were doomed to feel eerily strange immediately because they're all used for one specific thing. Although it's never clear exactly what, when, or even at all. They're just dead. Lying in wait. For nothing if you've already played the mission it's used for, or nothing if you don't intend to. Not to mention if it was part of some cancelled beta mission, or even if it was just made and intended for absolutely nothing at all. Which is the case for the majority of the locations in this game, because they're never used again. Nothing will ever happen here again. Forever. And the world is just composed entirely of them. A lot of really interesting tucked away areas that are these little experiences to explore and discover like you will nowhere else. But more importantly, areas that can all only really be properly shown off through a kind of virtual tour of the entire map. And needless to say, certain areas specifically have more of an effect on me and will on you depending entirely on how much of the game you're prepared to look past. Because the point being that ultimately it really doesn't matter if any of this was intentional or a mistake, what caused it or what little story is behind it, because it just is what it is. And if you let it speak for itself, that's exactly what it does. Portland, for example, being the game's starting area, was everyone's first real visual and thematic introduction to this game. But more importantly, the only part of the game they ever got to see if they didn't progress because either they didn't own the game personally or they just wanted to mess around. Or, you know, more likely if they just happened to be 12 and got indefinitely stuck on that one boat mission. Because the point being, due to the storyline following the protagonist being betrayed and sent back to the very bottom to slowly work their way back up the crime ladder, the game naturally starts at the bottom, Portland being the designated, deprived, poverty-stricken, crime-ridden area of this game. That being the intention anyway, at least. Because the fact is, and remains, that in actual practice, it really doesn't matter, because the effect it actually had left a lasting impact forever. Because, due entirely to that decision, from that moment on, this deprived, poverty-stricken, crime-ridden island is largely what the whole game is associated with, and again, what the majority of people only really ever got to see. When you think GTA 3, I'm willing to bet the vast majority of mental images that come to you include things like the burning car, the hospital, the port, the Salvatore mansion, rolling your car off this one cliff and having to walk all the way back up to the road, all because they're immediately accessible without having to play any missions in a game that was built around the most fun part being anything other than the missions, or at least the part that would have been the most novel and immediately interesting at the time. What I'm saying is that they were asking for this, because being all immediately accessible and immediately depressing just leaves such a strong, lasting first impression, and an impression that is one of the biggest reasons GTA 3 stands out to me and so many others as the dreary, dismal game we love so much. Ironically, it's the only island to have a beach, and beaches are great at brightening the tone of games, usually, but here it's so sad and grey, I don't think I've seen them be done this way anywhere else. It's like so depressingly realistic that it's almost funny. The cold sea breeze, waves, birds, you can almost smell the dead fish. It's one of the furthest points you can get from a road in the game, so it's the most isolated you'll ever be. And again, you're just looking around for anything, the purpose of it. Because more likely than not, the only thing you'll find is just the clearest view of this game's weirdest mystery. That one empty, abandoned lighthouse. Probably the best example there is in this game of it must be there for something, right? Can you get there? No. Is it populated? No. Does it move? Turn on? No. So you just stand here on the beach looking out at it, just waiting for something. Anything to happen. And obviously it doesn't, because it is nothing. So it's hard to accept for most people. It's just weird. And not to be pedantic, but it's not even the right color. It would have been so much less memorable if it was literally just red and white like lighthouses are supposed to be. Then nearby, that means you would have also ran into the also abandoned, longest, darkest, most out-of-place tunnel that has ever had any business just existing. It's implied to be a disused section of train track, but it just starts and ends right here. There's nowhere it could have even gone when it wasn't disused, because it just runs directly into the ocean on one side and this huge supermarket on the other. That, by the way, is also a thing, somehow, despite always being completely empty, and only ever the same two cars being out front in the car park. Again, I feel like I'm going to be saying this all the time, but yeah, I get it, video game. But it doesn't take much for it to be weirdly unsettling, especially if you want it to be, and I do. Like, do I even need to mention the 4 homeless people ominously stood in the very center of the tunnel, completely motionless and unresponsive to anything you do? Because nothing, them nor the tunnel, is used for or around any implemented mission. It's not even a road. Yet everyone who has played this knows about it, because they found it themselves, and were thrown from normality enough that it made this strong of an impression. Because the lack of any real closure to this situation means you really are just left to let your imagination take over. Portland in general though, just as a theme, is somewhere between falling apart and being torn apart by something. As in, visually, it looks way more like a war zone than any American city, much less New York. The bridge is a big one, since it's big, meaning both that it's in view most of the time and that you're left to assume it took an impressive amount of effort to destroy on the terrorists' part, which is a harrowing thought on its own, and seeing it constantly is a reminder of that. But then there's like these sections of street that have just been leveled for no discernible reason. Chunks of the road have been taken out, pipes exposed, rubble thrown everywhere. The nearby homes in the same state have all the floor's wallpaper exposed, which just gives such an unnecessary level of humanity to the world. There is no reason the player should be made to sit here upon discovering this and think about the people that might have once lived here. In a game like GTA. Work was put into this, real work and effort, but for what other reason than to elicit these unsettling feelings? It doesn't matter when or even if it's ever explained, and in this case it isn't anyway, because it's not explained now when the player would need it most. Like is absolutely the case with the mansion, because it's just the most accessible by far. For one thing, it's like the game naturally ushers you in its direction regardless of how you're playing. So as a result, a lot of people naturally find they have memories of walking in on it, to find this eerie, permanently empty and unnaturally clean Art Deco-ish lounge and bar that could have easily passed for someone's home or an empty social club if it wasn't for the weird ambient jazz that's coming from somewhere. Because, like I've mentioned with most of the game's audio, it gives life to places out of sight, and makes you feel like someone should be here. But there isn't. Ever. And it's such a bizarre feeling, because the player in most cases would have no context. Although, to be fair, even with context, having played the missions, you've killed the man who lived here, and the room is just this immaculate snapshot frozen in time. Music playing on loop. Forever. It's definitely one of the more standout moments of the game, and again, it isn't even really part of the game. Like with the tunnel though, a lot of areas may very well have had an intended purpose or use that was just never finished, or just that never made it in for whatever reason. And that might at the very least help to ease some of the weirdness a little, although like the mansion shows, it doesn't really at all. Portland's Sawmill, however, is an example of a place that somehow has neither. For a start, it's a real pain to get into, so it's safe to say that most people just wouldn't have. But what that means is if you did, it's doubly effective at creating a real sense of you being out of place, like you shouldn't be here, that you're trespassing, because of the fight to get in. But what's even here to trespass on? All you'll start to hear is the distant sound of grinding machinery and buzzsaws. It puts you in a state of looking for something. Anything, a state that makes you the most susceptible to seeing or thinking you've seen something. The biggest cause, in my opinion, of spawning internet gaming mysteries and urban legends, which in turn just adds to the game's atmosphere even more, thus creating a never-ending cycle of increasing underlying tension. Another huge thing this game suffers from just in general. I mean, in this case, there is like a gun and some armor on the roof, so you can assume that was the point, but what I'm saying is it's not enough. It was never gonna be enough. The examples are endless, and I wish I could sit here and list absolutely everything, and I could, believe me. Those red windows, the weird voids behind the townhouses, all the empty parks, the train platforms, the school buses, buildings that literally couldn't physically exist because of their size or dimensions, lack of doors. But if I did, this could quite easily just go on forever. So when it comes to Portland though, again, I'll sum it up by saying that this doesn't mean that the feelings end here, just that it definitely starts strong. Staunton Island, just as it comes to you in-game, before you've physically even gotten there, is just this sprawling metropolis in the distance, all lit up, eerily clean, looking almost heavenly relative to where you are. Because, like we've established, Portland is the most a lot of people ever got, so the majority of people's experiences with Staunton would have just been its skyline, out there, across the ocean, looking nothing like Portland. The exact opposite. Really just inspiring your imagination, even now, but especially if you're only at this point in the game, because you can literally see the rest of the game out there ahead of you, there in the distance across the sea. It's this really cool, daunting feeling that you're just insignificant relative to the scale of the city, which all good open world games tend to do really well. But when that city just is absolutely everything I've covered so far, the scale of everything I've covered so far is blown up to a similar extent. The island itself is the game's designated commercial district, so it's largely all like corporate and government buildings, shops and parks. A huge, immediately obvious just reality that the island and the game happens to benefit from though is just the times that produced it. It's seen everywhere in the general aesthetic of like the cars, advertisements and technology, but by far the most notable and my favourite is here in the commercial and office buildings. Like nowadays, the look businesses all try desperately to give off is this soft, friendly, homely vibe, but back around this time with the dot-com boom, it was all about being cold, clean looking, like pioneers in the new digital age. Geometric modern art sculptures, sharp angular buildings, everything's clean and reflective. The game didn't ask for it, necessarily even want it, but the atmosphere it gives the environment is something that massively exaggerates how cold and eerie the game is anyway. It's comparable to the tone of The Matrix, all foreboding and dark, that the world is overtly run by megacorps that aren't even hiding before a time when they knew any better. All these dead skyscrapers, empty courtyards and business parks, abandoned underground multi-story car parks, seemingly the game's equivalent of Times Square with maybe a max of 4 or 5 people walking through at any one time. And I know the effect the game wants it to have, but when all the windows are either blacked out or taped on 2D images, that's just what it ends up looking like. This. Going back to an earlier point, because the game is at its core a fake environment trying desperately to look as real as possible, it just has that in common with something like, for example, those North Korean propaganda streets and shops. Uncanny. Because it looks real enough that just one off element throws your brain out of trusting any of it. And it's that which works with how well done all the corporate and business elements look. Because had they not have been quite so well implemented, you might not have found yourself asking, but where's all the cars, people, life? Anything, which is another huge part of the game as a whole. There's like this church just thrown in the middle of everything, and to be fair, churches in major cities always look out of place, but here, strangely, it's like everything around it is more so out of place. With the weather and ambience, general tone, the church just makes sense, and I can't really explain why. I mean, it looks creepy, but that's the point. It's gothic, imposing, humbling. It makes you want to explore it to naturally find it has a cemetery that you'd otherwise never even know about because it's just tucked away, literally hidden. Most people forget this game even has a cemetery. The construction sites always gave me a similar feeling. They're like the skeleton version of the buildings that were ominous enough when they were complete. And here they're equally as barren and void of life. Justifiably so, at least, but still it's a weirdly large amount of space to give something that's used as much as it is. It's a whole quarter of an island, practically, and even then there's a lot more vertical space. You're bound to end up here a lot just through casual play because it's such a big area, but also because it's right next to the hospital where you spawn. But to find what? Floors that lead to more empty floors, wide open plains of dirt and rubble, the silhouettes of like a broken skyline. In fact, that just about perfectly summarizes the entire island. For what's supposed to be the city part of the city map, more of it is just these parks than anything else, if you really looked at the actual space. The main one that's modelled on Central Park, to its credit, is one of the few non-road areas in the game to be given pedestrian zones, meaning you're not completely alone, at least, but again also meaning that the pedestrians spawn and all wander around following each other, all bumping bumping into things like lost animals. And, well, there's that for one, but it also leaves, like the basketball courts, monuments, and public bathrooms, dead. So despite the fact that you can't exactly ask yourself where is everyone, your subconscious can still question what's up with everyone, because it just being a quiet day isn't a possibility here. There are a number of interiors in this game that are used as backdrops for story cutscenes to take place in. I always thought one of the coolest aspects of the game was how they're all where they should be technically in-universe, regardless of the fact that you can't ever physically get to any of them, excluding the outside ones. Apart from one in particular for some strange reason. Because instead of just closing the door and locking you out, which would have been super simple and fit in with every other interior, not only is it accessible, but it's the only place in the entire game where the camera fade transitions to a static angle that then pans to different shots through the fully modeled room. To jump forward to a point I'll be making later, Grand Theft Auto 3 did not need any more comparisons to survival horror games as it is. But this really just feels like nothing other than a deliberate intentional reference to Resident Evil, or more so the opening of Silent Hill 2. If it wasn't for the fact that Silent Hill 2 wouldn't even be out for another year after this. And this aspect specifically is something that's always tripped me up whenever I talk about it, because if you really wanted to read into it way too much, it would seem to imply that they were aware of what their game looked like on the surface. My favourite area though, by far, not just on the island but in the game, is the one I just so happened to discover last. This whole time playing this game for years, sometimes to 100% completion, although most of the time not, I was just completely unaware that this one footpath at the very top of the map even existed. It like traces the very edge of the island and leads to this little staircase and pier that only really serves to give you this weird view of the third island's abandoned picnic area and cliff face. But it's like lined with these beautiful street lights, cobblestone walls, park benches pointing out to the lights of distant apartment blocks. It feels like it's encouraging me to play the game in this way. Because ultimately it is really only that. But I love it so much just because it does everything the game does well. The fact that I only ran into it for the first time recently stands as a testament to the game's weird design choices that led to the state it was released in. It's where this aspect peaks, because it's such a nice little spot for such an irrelevant part of the game, especially if you're looking at it in terms of gameplay. But even when you're not, since there's not even a hidden package or collectible here. Because through playing this, you slowly start to get the impression, by running into them, that all the hidden packages were some desperate attempt at giving a point to all the otherwise unused space in this game, filling it in as if some kind of attempt to tie it all together and reduce all the redundant areas I've been complimenting up until this point. But in doing so, in a way, that also means that they've marked out all the spots they feel are the most unused, giving you a cool map of the best places to explore. And my point here being though that it almost transcends even that, meaning it can only really be here for the purpose of looking around and soaking it in. Because maybe the view was the point. I mean, it's likely and would make sense. It was a big part of the game's identity at the time, being this massive 3D open world sandbox. Your eventual introduction to the game's third island comes as reluctantly as it possibly could have, falling flat on your lap almost like it was only really because it had to. And even then it feels way more like an extension of the second that didn't even really need to be here at all, to be honest. Needless to say, and unsurprisingly at this point, it feels like it couldn't even really exist. But not in the same way as the other areas. Like, even in this game's world, it shouldn't. Mostly due in large part because unlike the previous one, and other than the parts I've mentioned already, very little of it is visible to you at first. I mean, yeah, sure, because both there isn't much to see and even really hear at all anyway, but I think the point is to create the sense that it isn't even really part of the rest of the map at all, as if it's upstate, in the country,
as much as that was possible anyway. Yeah, there's also the fact, and not that it's necessarily the case here, but most games do tend to have their second half just hanging off anyway, which is normal and would seem to explain some of the most standout oddities. Like, it feels almost as if it was made by someone in some kind of hectic state, sort of frantically putting shit just anywhere, and arbitrarily drawing lines between 2 points, joining them with roads that were already started but that just had no real intended destination. It has easily by far the strangest, most nonsensical layout ever conceived, and when your layout, your undecorated outline of a map is uncanny, you can only really go up from there. Obviously, you get used to it eventually, but it's as hard to explain as it is to navigate. It's almost as if the island is 2 separate mini-islands with their own districts, joined by one giant figure-of-8 loop. It creates the sense that everything is deceptively further away than it appears, and there's this learning curve to knowing which way around is the quickest to get anywhere. It feels like the roads just end and pick up all over the place where they shouldn't. Sometimes not even picking up at all, and a lot of the time not even feeling like there's any real point to them because there's no destination. And yet they're all still somehow bunched up enough to need these constant elevated bridges and ramps, knotting them all together in this giant mess that's way more complicated than it needed to be. Meaning, ultimately though, that exploring the island puts you in this constant, permanent state of being lost even when you never really are. It's amazing and definitely not a bad thing, despite the fact it sounds like I'm complaining, because like I've said, it feels like the intention was to create some kind of outskirt, a scenic town in the hills, and the extent of that is just like this. And that's it. This one stretch of road. Because other than that, it mostly just ends up feeling like another Portland, for a bunch of reasons, the least of which being the almost identical apartment complex, but you know, there can be more than one in any city. Then there's all the warehouses, garages, and industrial space that leaves it feeling like a dumping ground for assets that were just left over. Like a graveyard. Not that it is by any means, but it's so small and there's so much less to see here in comparison to the other islands that it feels like a kind of best of or greatest hits. Like a curated museum with a little industrial, commercial and residential district all in little tasters. The landmarks Shoreside Vale is known for, in quotes, because I feel like people don't really know this place at all, are mostly like the dam, the airport and the 2 tunnels into the game. The dam is this sprawling mega complex, the type of stuff you see in megalophobia edits. It just makes you feel small and lost, and unlike every other industrial spot in the game, it's this eerily clean white wall curving off into the distance, disappearing behind the fog. It's this bleak metallic machinescape, and again, because it's used for the final mission, if you're here at any other point, or if you didn't know that, it has this creepy feeling of being in wait for something. Like an empty shopping mall or school, everything is set up, in place, ready to be populated with people, collectibles, set pieces. But now it's just not. And the atmosphere of it all is only something that can really ever be shown. The tunnels are my favourite because after everything I've mentioned so far, they actually went out of their way to literally trap you here, in this world. In this hell. There's no escape. The only way in and out by road is through here, and you're not getting in and out through here. It's never explained because it couldn't really ever be. It doesn't make any sense. It's an aspect of this realistic, grounded open world game that isn't realistic or grounded, leading you straight into thinking that this is real too. That this could happen to you. Sure, despite how unlikely that is, but isn't that what all horror media relies on? Everything you see driving and walking around just leads to such a weird view of this world, because it's scenic, which is the point, being the scenic part of the world, but it's scenic in the sense that you actually stop and view the scene. To see this. The game's airport is a perfect example of that. I mean, it might as well be its whole own area. As a concept, to add to the game, it's about as well thought out as the other public transport systems in that it hardly is thought out at all. But at the end of the day, their only option was to either have a plane show up every 5 minutes just to do a little circle on the tarmac, drop off and pick up no one, then leave again in the same direction, or to have nothing ever show up at all. Again, a lose-lose situation, but this way is just the much more uncanny, surreal, and oddest loss to just watch. Both in concept and because of the slightly janky animation. The planes aren't even solid physical things in this world. I mean, did they really think people weren't going to try and drive into them? Not to mention the fact that because there is literally no other life here at all, it's almost as if your attention is drawn to them more. It really is just one of the strangest and most atmospheric areas to explore in any game I've ever played. The airport is a liminal space in the most traditional sense and most literal meaning of the word. It's a physical location that's just no one's destination. Everyone here is just passing through, never to stop. And again, by everyone, I am of course only talking about the planes, assuming they have passengers, because otherwise the place is ominously devoid of any other life. And it being an airport of all things just makes that so much more unusual, planting the seed that something is wrong here. Off. Because where is everyone? Which also, conveniently, brings me nicely to the point. Finally. But probably the most bizarre point I plan on making here. It is amazing how Silent Hill 2 is not only the best horror game ever made, not even just the best game ever made, but it's just the game. The game that's used as the example, the standard to point to learn from as a project, an operation that just had the best possible outcome any piece of art could ever even hope to have had. And the example that shows exactly what can happen when the stars align entirely in your favour and everything works out exactly how it's supposed to. Or at least in a way that works to benefit the finished product. So yeah, you could say I'm a fan. And whereas with this video I'm fighting to get at least some people on my side, everyone, if not quite that, will at some level agree that Silent Hill 2 is a very good game. To digress during my digression a little, there is so little room to interpret Silent Hill 2 in any other way than it presents itself because of how immaculately executed the entire thing is from start to finish, top to bottom. I mean, you can, and I'd encourage you to go ahead and interpret it however you wanted to, just good luck is what I'm saying. Interpret both in terms of narrative, if you're the kind of English professor type where everything has to mean something or be some kind of deep symbolic metaphor, because it is that if that's your thing, but also, and more to do with what I'm talking about, and if you're more like me, simply in the literal, personal sense of the feelings and emotions its environment, sound and visuals all elicit within you. Because, put simply, the fog is here to isolate you, restrict your vision and make you feel alone and vulnerable. The colour palette is this bleak so that it feels dreary, ethereal and dreamlike. The sounds are everywhere, deep, subtle, and are all these metallic and industrial drones to throw you off, and so on. And although I'm not here to talk about that, though believe me I could, the point being, regardless of everything I've said so far, and if you were to imagine I had said none of it and simply opened on this, you can see exactly how little it really matters, what the intention was, how much effort and work was done by who and distributed where, when the end results are just what it is. This. Near identical. Alright, fair enough, they're both very similar looking games, in large part because their art styles are going for photorealism using the same hardware, and are from around the same time, and I know that by saying this there's an implication that downplays what Silent Hill 2 achieved, and trust me, I'm the last person ever who wants to do that, but it also, I think, finally gives due credit to what early Rockstar were out here doing. Because more importantly, and I cannot overstate this, if you take nothing else away with you from this video, take this. Thanks almost entirely to GTA 3 and the many things I've highlighted here, a long time ago I just realised one day that we don't need games to hold our hands in the way they do, or how everyone expects them to. Obviously, it would be the dumbest thing I'd ever do if I were to try and say that I was the first or only one to ever realise this. I just think the personal journey I took through this game to get to this point was interesting enough to share through this. We don't need them to tell us what they are, and we don't even really need to listen when they do. In fact, I'd say that in doing so, it's almost wasting their potential, restricting what they could be to so many people. Modern art has always been a controversial subject for some reason, long before I was born, and it will be long after my death. I'm not going to try and solve that one, don't worry. But I feel like people are just completely ignorant of the fact that a lot of what they see and feel is their fault, both when it works and is good and when it doesn't. That it's their own short-sighted lack of imagination, unwillingness to sit down and really get into something that's why they can't. Because to use this example, if like me, you just always wanted more Silent Hill 2, it's everywhere, all around you. Even in the most unlikely of places, you just need to be prepared to look. Because it's in realizing all this that your third eye bursts from your forehead and you suddenly find yourself completely independent of pointless IPs corporations want you to believe are wholly unique to them, just so they can monetize your interests and turn you into a reliably consistent revenue stream whenever they release a new product. It's just one big meme. So yeah, that's GTA 3. That is literally everything GTA 3 is to me, and that contributes to the feeling the game gives off. A feeling that I refer to as that GTA 3 feeling. To conclude though, finally, I need to address the fact that the longer these kinds of things go on for, the less digestible they are, meaning they're way less likely to get through to anyone. I am aware of that, and it's unfortunate, but at the same time, the more I need to admit in the interest of keeping it brief, the more room there is to misunderstand or misinterpret what I'm saying. Because, like I've said, I have tried to have this conversation before countless times in the past, but the most common barrier I'll face is people's inability to see how a game with all these innuendos and jokes can have an atmosphere. So naturally, spending time away from that to cover every other area is really the only way you're going to get removed from that far enough as to where it isn't as distracting, in my argument anyway. Because I guess that's also the point. It's a blank canvas, and if you want to see the humour and jokes, then hell yeah, do that, go for it. It's still a fascinating game for that and so many other reasons. The point of this video is just that it didn't put up a fight and made it really difficult for me to see any other aspect than its atmospheric side. So just enjoy it, see what you want to. But why not try this out? Do yourself a favour and play this game again, but differently. Sit down, turn off the lights, put on your preferred copy, and just explore. Walk around, take in the scenery, sounds, observe it as if a person who is actually here, in the world. And I promise, you'll see it differently.